before we begin, you have the ticker.
I do. I'm doing it. I'm taking it.
Okay. Before we begin, we have to thank the sponsors for Midwest Dreamin. Midwest Dreamin would not have happened if it wasn't for these wonderful people.
Exactly. Each and every one of these sponsors, including Neocall. Neocall, I have no idea what Neocall does. Do you, Brian?
Not a clue.
And that's why you should go to the Expo floor and find out what Neocall does.
My name is Brian Kwong. I'm the VP of Delivery and Operations for Better Partners, a consulting shop based up in Milwaukee. No. I'm a Salesforce MVP, hold multiple certifications. And I'm also known as the Salesforce Wizard, or as most people like to say, look, it's the guy in the hat.
And I am Mark Ross. Okay, we're just going to move around until we find a safe spot. I'm Mark Ross, Salesforce Practice Director at Chris Group, also an MVP, also got a bunch of certifications, yada, yada, yada.
So, we're here to talk about, turn your mic off when you're not talking. I don't know how else we're going to do this. So, we're here to talk about flow. Before we do that, we have to define what it is. So, flow is something that you can create forms and then display that data, that even though it's not tied directly to a record.
If you push the talking bit, all right, here we go. Also, in flow, you can actually use logic. You can use decision trees. You can actually choose different paths and by which you're acting upon various pieces of data.
You can combine your Salesforce data with additional user input and then use that to create, update, or even delete records.
And then all of this, as long as you don't have a screen in your flow, you can actually fire it off of Process Builder. So if X happens, go fire this process and call this flow to do this much more complicated things you would not ordinarily be able to do with Process Builder alone.
So, what is flow? Baby, don't hurt me, don't hurt me no more.
Brian, don't quit your day job.
You're so mean.
Brian?
Yes?
That's a flow.
Oh. What is it?
So a flow, if you notice, it is essentially a kind of like a flow chart, right? It's like a Visio document. It is something, you do this, then do this, then do this, and each of those things, each of those elements on the flow screen does something, whether it's a query or an update or just making some sort of logical step.
So we've talked about what flow is. Now we should talk about why are we here. So first off, there's the official wonderful description about flow being declarative code for admins, being a powerhouse to manipulate Salesforce.com like the admin gods we are. But, you know, Mark and I, we're here because we're really big fans of flow. You might, fans. You might say we're fanatics of flow, or flow fanatics.
Or maybe even flownatics.
Maybe not.
Excuse me, this requires a costume change?
It's not already hot.
Things I do for my art.
Sexy back, baby.
You know that.
These are Star Trek robes, or Star Wars robes.
Very good.
Oh, I just committed a felony. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this annual meeting of the Flownatics Association.
What's a fanatic, Brother Mark?
Flownatic, Brother Brian, is someone who loves to create flow, who endeavors to replace as much code and apex with flow as they possibly can. Somebody who knows their vocabulary and also appreciates the good flow pun from time to time.
So we will begin today's meeting by standing. Seriously, everyone stand. Raise your hand and repeat after me. Oh, sorry. I, my name, pledge to uphold the values and best practices of the Flownatics. I solemnly swear upon the pain of Apex to share and spread the good word of the Flownatics to all who would listen, and especially to those who don't.
I solemnly swear upon the pain of Apex to share and spread the good word of Flownatics to all who will listen, especially to those who don't.
I shall forever hold flow as my primary starting element deep in my heart, mind, and soul, and web browser.
I shall forever hold flow as my primary starting element, deep in my heart, mind, soul, and web browser.
I shall never underestimate the power of the flow.
I shall never underestimate the power of the flow.
I shall forever remain flow-efficient.
I shall forever remain flow-efficient.
May the flow be with us always.
May the flow be with us always.
All right, sit down.
And also with
Let us start by reading from the sacred book.
Yes, reading from the Flow Code. Please, everyone, turn in your pew books to Brian. Where are the pew books? Did you forget the pew books again?
I ran out of blood.
Right, we'll do it from the slides. Today, we shall start with code number 25. Don't fear the lightning.
Don't fear the lightning, baby, take my hand.
This is not the musical episode, Brian. We have to be at least 5 seasons in before we can do the musical episode.
Okay.
All right. So, lightning with flow is actually extremely powerful. Yes, I know, lightning. I said lightning. It had some trouble starting out, but it's actually really strong now. And the things you can do with flow in it are things you cannot do in classic. One of the big things is the ability to actually embed flow as a component in a lightning page. So see this here, over here, this right here, this is a flow. There we go.
I love trade audiences.
So this is a flow. It's an honest to God, like made in flow and embedded here. That's something you can do in any lightning page. All you have to do is make sure your flow has a screen, and you can choose to show it there. And it doesn't have to be on a record either. You can make a custom, what is it called, a lightning component app, which is its own dedicated page called from a tab, and you can embed it on there. So you can basically have a dedicated tab in Salesforce that just runs a flow, and that's it. Also, we can now have lightning components in flow itself. And that is lightning component of the definition of small, base lightning components. If you're not entirely familiar, lightning components is kind of a catch-all term. It can mean these big things, or it can mean really small things, like a button or a slider. And we now have the ability to add custom lightning components. Now, somebody has to code those and add them in, but I'll get to that in a moment. And there's all sorts of things you can add, like, for example, out on the internet, you can find, right now, a lookup field lightning component you can add to your flow screens.
Yes, that's a big deal. That's a plus.
It doesn't mean as much when you ask them to do it, Brian.
Look, we ran out of the budget. I couldn't afford the person to hold up the sign.
So, yeah, it's because we've all had that pain, right? You want to have an actual honest-to-God lookup with a magnifying glass to click and actually get, we can do that now through the lightning components. Something else you can add is something called a flow local action. This is new, really new, and it's not the most intuitive name, but in this case, a local action means it is accessing your local browser. So it is literally your flow interacting through JavaScript with whatever your web browser is. And what that can be used for, big example that comes to my mind right off the bat, is the ability to navigate to a page immediately after, or immediately in your flow. So you can actually have your screen doing stuff, yes, we're good, click finish, and then have another flow element that says go to screen, and it will have you go to whatever screen you put into that, which can be the record you just created in your flow. You can now navigate to it.
No more Visualforce pages,
No
more
Visual
custom
Force.
Apex to do the redirect. You just need to have the flow or lightning component once as a local action, and you can reuse it wherever you want.
And that is something, again, you can download from the internet, like right now. I have done it. I have used it. It exists. It is live. It is real. I know. The internet exists. Lightning quick actions. This is the ability to embed flow into a quick action. Now that can be a couple different things. It can be this. Here, a button, which calls a flow. What you do is you go into your custom object, you go into buttons, links, and actions, you make an action, and you tell it to reference the flow, and that will reference that and put that button there. You can also, by virtue of it being in an action, means that you can put it in mobile. Because that's what those things are at the bottom of your mobile client, right? Your new task, new event, those are all actions. So you can now make an action that calls a flow, and it works in mobile as well, mobile flow. All of these things that I've just talked about, well, I'm sorry, the two things I talked about with the Lightning components and the local actions, that I said you can go download them from the internet, those are on lightningflow.net. That is a site, it's a Google site that's run by some of the Salesforce product managers for Flow. And there's some really, really good stuff on there for you to download and install.
Code 33. A fanatic shall always document and plan. So, I know people...
That's me.
I know that people love documenting, right? It's our favorite thing to do. But it's really important, and you need to do it before you build your flow, and during your flow building, and have it after. And the reason for that is flow can be really complicated. It can be really, really simple, but it can also get really complicated, and planning what you need and how you want it to run beforehand, even if you're just scribbling it on a piece of paper or a whiteboard, can really help you decide how's the flow going to actually work, what elements do you need, are you missing important data, what types of pitfalls could you fall, and so forth. So you can document wherever you want.
Right, you can use anything. It can be scratch paper, it can be Quip, it can be elements.cloud, which is the example you see here. As long as you get it down, and preferably, if you work with a team, get it down in a place where your team can access it as well.
And then, of course, once it's been documented and you build your flow, it's really important to have it and keep it in a very easily accessible place. Because I don't know about you, I build a lot of flows and then 6 months later go, what is this doing? How does this work? Because suddenly something's failing and you're trying to figure out what is missing from this. And if you don't have your nice little documents and you say, well, this is what it's doing and this is, it can take you hours and hours and hours to basically rebuild the flow in your head to determine what it's actually doing so you know how to fix it. So it's really important to always plan what you're going to build in flow and then document what the flow is doing and then put it someplace so you can use it for maintenance later.
Code number 316. Test as other users, lest ye be judged. Now, we all make flows, right? If we've been doing flow, we make them, but when we make them as an admin, right? And sure, maybe we think, oh yeah, we need to go test this, we need to make sure it runs, but how do we usually test it? We usually go as an admin and test and make sure it works. Or we use the debug button, the brand new debug button in Summer 18. It's an amazing feature, and that runs as you, as an admin. But what about your other users? Who's going to be using this flow? Is it going to be you? Probably not. It's going to be your users. And your users have a whole lot of things different than you do about their access. First and foremost, field level security, right? If you're using that at all in your system, you might have access to every single field, but they don't necessarily. You might have a company culture where things are a lot more locked down. Maybe you've got PII, PHI, things like that, and you've got to keep things locked down. Well, you're going to be able to see everything, they're not. So you need to make sure that your flow is actually going to run with their field level security. Same with their object permissions. Maybe they don't have access to every single object, but your flow happened to call it. Well, unless you remember that, and unless you happen to write that in, they're not going to see it. So you've got to be sure you test for that as well. Profile permissions, certain things like there is a run flows checkbox on a profile. If they don't have that, they're not going to be able to run it. View all users. If you have any kind of user query in your flow, that will fail if they don't have view all users. View converted leads. If you are accessing converted leads, if they don't have that checked, they won't be able to see it. Finally, license issues. Portal users can't see everything that regular users can. Platform users, you got to make sure that, because they don't see opportunities, leads, campaigns, cases, all those things which are Sales Cloud, Service Cloud. They don't see all those. So it's easy to forget while you're building whether something you're working on until the users actually go in. And then finally, of course, on the user page itself, there is that flow user checkbox. You got to make sure it's checked as well. So log in as your users to be sure.
Code 145, watch thy limits. And no, I don't mean these limits. Although you should totally watch them because they're hilarious.
Yeah.
Apex and limits, they're fantastic.
YouTube, search for Apex and limits.
But here's the thing.
Shameless plugging.
We don't do shameless plugs here. That's why you see the podcast logo in the member slide. So what limits are we talking about? There's tons of limits. For example,
So this one doesn't get talked about a lot, but it's really critical. And that is the 2,000 element limit at runtime per flow. Now, what this means, remember elements? Elements are each of the individual boxes on a flow. You can only have 2,000 of those running in a single thing. And you think, oh, well, that's fine. I'm never going to hit that. Because I'm only going to be at 10 or 15. I'm going to be good. Nay, nay, nay. Let's say you have a flow. Let's say you have a loop. And you're running through, let's say, 201 records in a loop. Right? And that loop has 10 elements in it. 10 times 201. You've gone over your limit. The whole thing is going to bomb out.
How will it bomb out? What error will you receive?
I don't remember, but it will be a catastrophic, cannot do anything error.
It's an unhandled fault.
It's all unhandled faults.
Everything's an unhandled fault, and it'll basically say, it gives you this really thing, tell your administrator this information, and it'll give you this long thing about limits and what the limit is. And then you'll get an email as well that gives you the exact same information. It just kills the whole thing.
Same thing if you're running anything through data loader. You're processing a whole bunch of records in data loader, 2,000 elements, that's a single runtime.
Next, query. So query is basically getting data. So if you're running Apex, that's writing a SQL clause. If you're using Flow, that's like a get record or a fast lookup. The thing of this is it's going to share this limit across all the Apex, all the process builders, and the flows that are running within a single transaction. So as Mark said, if you did a data loader of 200 records, that 200 records is everything that is going to be running. So all the triggers that fire for those 200 records, all the process builders that get fired, and all the flow that gets fired are all sharing this wonderful limit in queries. And
now, ideally, you're going to have bulkified code, so that won't necessarily be a problem. Ideally, also, the system will attempt to bulkify on the back end your flow process. It will see that this query is like this query, is like this query, and it will try to run them in a single query. But it's not guaranteed. It's system guesswork. Also, number of records from queries that you can get from queries is 50,000. That's it. You can't access more than that, or else that lookup query will fail.
And if you're creating records and updating the name, those are called DML statements. And you can only have 150 of those. So this is a good example of why we tell people don't do your fast updates and your record updates within a loop, because every time you hit that within your loop, that counts towards your DML statement. It's a lot better to go through and say, I'm going to build up a collection of all the records that I need to update or create, and then once the loop is completed, then you do your fast update or fast create against the subject collection variable. Because otherwise, you will hit that limit, and believe me, it does not take long to hit that limit.
Question?
If you know that you've got a user interface, they're allowed to check 200 records, and they submit the button, the action that we've created, and it puts those 200 records into the flow, is there some creative way that we can basically work around the limits and break it into chunks to try to reduce the risk?
Yes, but. Okay, so the question is, if you know that your user says select 201 records and it's going to throw a limit, can you do something? So one of the things that you can do with the Summer 18 is you can go through the collection and do a count into a variable, say how many records are in that collection. And from there you can decide what should you do. Depending upon your use case, you have some options. One of them is you can have the flow go through a decision that says if the number of records is greater than X, then go through and pass all that data into an invocable Apex where Apex can handle a lot more code. You could also, and this is the tricky part that I don't usually recommend to people, although it is declarative, you can run things through your loop, have it go through and say, hey, we're about to hit the limit, stop, do your update or create, go to a wait node, and have it wait for a period of time, like 5 minutes, an hour, and then continue on. Because that when that resumes, that's considered a separate transaction.
Thank you.
The wait element automatically starts a new runtime.
Thank you.
But yeah, we haven't really, it's riskier that way.
What makes it
Theoretically it
riskier?
works.
Why is it risky?
Because you
We'll
never
get to
have-
that.
Yeah. All right. So, total records processed in DML, 10,000. Notice, you can query 50,000 records, but you can only update 10,000 of them.
Scheduled actions. So these are things like time-lapsed, or time-scheduled items in Process Builder, or using that wait node that I just talked about. You can only have 30,000 of these actions waiting to be processed.
Across the entire org.
Across the entire org. And that sounds like a lot, but if you imagine that you have something that fires to send an email 5 minutes after a lead was created and someone imports a huge lead from a trade show, you just blew your limit. So it's one of those things you need to be aware about. I usually don't use a whole lot of wait nodes in my flows because it adds a lot of complexity that you usually don't need. But it's something to be, when you're looking at planning out your automation across the org, you have to keep that in mind because it's shared with Process Builder as well as with your flows.
And by the same token, just because you have 30,000 waiting or scheduled actions doesn't mean that you could resume them all at once. So again, that same circumstance, firing off 30,000 5 minutes after, well, you can only do 1,000 per hour.
And that's an example. You asked why it's risky to use that wait node. This is a good example because depending on your use case and how many times you're going to be waiting in those flows, you could either hit the total limit or you can run out of your 1,000 actions in an hour and you're kind of stuck.
What happens when you run past those 1,000? Does it fail silently? Do you get an email?
I don't know.
Which is why we put the next bullet here.
Yes, this is a link to the official Salesforce documentation, which talks about all these limits. Code number 666.
Hello.
Flow is not always the answer.
What is that an image of?
That is a solvent which prevents dyes from running in Fabric. Why? What did you think it was, Brian?
Not safe for public
Okay.
consumption.
So there are some reasons why you want to be careful about Flow. As we said before, mass data operations can be difficult, right? If you're running, 20,000 records through a data loader process, through an ETL exercise, if there's let's say a process that runs every time one of those records is updated, that process is going to get hit every single time. You're going to hit your runtime very, very easily.
And that includes API calls. So
Exactly.
if you have multiple data sources out there that are pulling data into Salesforce, say on a nightly basis from your sales database, you will hit your limit with lots of records. Because let's face it, with APIs, it could be one record, it could be millions of records. And so this is where you need to, again, plan out what your flow is doing and understand what the use case is so you can decide, do I use Flow or should I go and use Apex?
You can do things like tweak your batch size and things like that to help, but just be aware of it. Another item you need to be sure you're considering is your user interface and your user experience. Flow is great. It's not always the best for users, right? If you end up making a flow where you're actually having to do more clicks, more scrolling, that's not a good solution for your users. They're going to hate you for it. So you want to be certain that you're actually considering that user experience as well. And by that same token, if Apex or Visualforce or a Lightning component is really just better, I'm sorry. I love Flow as much as everybody else. And I know we have our pledge at the beginning, like we'll always try to do Flow. But the thing is, sometimes it just is not the best solution. If you have to be overcomplicated, if you have to do a workflow here and a process kicking off this, which makes sure that we don't trigger off these validation rules, and it gets really, really, really complicated very quickly, that's not necessarily a better solution than just making one Lightning component. So overall, you need to make sure that you use the right tool for the right job, and that includes Flow. Code number 768, anticipate your errors by flowing for it.
What does that mean, Mark?
The error message, I personally don't understand it. That's
your
That's a
image.
very
I would
odd
hope you would
error
understand what your image is. But I was meaning, what's in the quotation? What do you mean by flowing for it?
So when coders are talking about how they might have some kind of user error that's going to cause trouble, they say they code for it, right? They code around it. And so from a flow standpoint, we are flowing for it. We're flowing around it. We're anticipating that some kind of error is going to be caused by a user and getting in front of it and actually putting something in the flow to catch it and address it. So in this example here, we're actually looking to see if the person who's running this flow is an actual user who's supposed to be running this flow. And if they're not, we're sending them to a screen and say, hey, you're not the right person to be able to run this, right? So what ordinarily would happen is maybe that would run and they'd get a validation error, or they'd get an unhandled fault or something because they don't have access to the object that this flow is trying to do. Instead, we're saying, hey, you don't have access to this, so please don't go any further. So we're getting in front.
Another common example is you're going to assume there's data coming into your flow. For example, you are querying an opportunity record and you're going to do something with that opportunity to create some other records. You're making the assumption that that data is filled in. Well, if it's not filled in and you get to the point where you're assigning it, creating it, it goes, this value's not been set, you can't set a null, or whatever this, I can't remember what the error message is. It's just bad. So if you know, hey, I need to have this piece of data further down in my flow, put a decision element at the start of your flow that says, okay, I'm starting off, do I have everything I need to do the rest of my operations down there? If you don't, you throw an error, you send a message, you display screen, whatever is appropriate for that particular flow.
Or even better, if they haven't put everything in, don't throw an error message. Ask them for it. Ask them for the information in the flow that they didn't put in before they started. That's user experience. Also, if you can, get in front of validation rules. Ideally, you should be preventing them from even hitting a validation rule once they've started the flow. You might even be able to get in front of it and prevent them from hitting a validation rule before they start the flow. If it's something embedded on a Lightning page, you can say, you can actually query the record as the flow runs on the Lightning page and say, hey, by the way, you're missing this, this, and this in its own little dedicated flow that's doing data quality checks.
Yeah, I think I have a blog post on that.
Do you now?
Yeah.
More shameless self-promotion.
Code 824. Repeatable action shall be sub-flowed. What is a picture? What is that?
It's a sub.
No, that's a Jeep.
It's a sub. It is a vehicle that is submerged and traveling in the water. It's a sub.
I hate you. Okay. What do I mean by that? So repeatable actions, things that you may need to do over and over and over again in more than one process. That's one reason. The other reason is it looks a lot nicer. So here's an example. Here's a nice big flow, right? Really easy to understand, really easy to show in a screenshot. I can quickly understand what everything's doing and what's doing. I have no clue what this is doing. Instead, if I use subflows, it breaks all that down into separate actions. So here I can quickly see, hey, I'm doing a lookup, I'm creating some products, and then I'm going to go create assets and then pass something back. Or I'm going to go and listen to the WizardCast, which you totally do. And then I'm going to go create contract products. So why is this nice? One, they're awesome because it's cleaner, right? This is a lot easier to read than that big, massive thing that we just saw. It's also easier to maintain. So if you're going to be creating contract products or you're going to create assets and you're going to have that fire in more than one place, like, hey, when this happens in an opportunity, I need to create assets, and if this happens later on in a different type of opportunity, I need to create assets, and if this happens, and so forth, it's a lot easier to go through and say, I'm going to update one flow that creates my assets than to have to go into multiple different flows that are all creating assets.
Or in the same flow multiple times.
Right. So again, this is where planning ahead of time can really benefit you down the road. It's more flexible. Subflows make things so much easier to be able to say, hey, I have this piece of thing I always do everywhere, so I'm going to go pass some information in, get information out. It allows you to build flows that can have lots of complicated pieces of information in it, but keep it really simple on the page. And of course, it's easier to screenshot for presentations, as well as for documentation.
Or writing a blog post.
Or writing a blog post.
If
Yes,
there are subflows, do the elements within a subflow count against the limit?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, no wait, that's clever. No going away about, you could do your weight node and then do a subflow, but,
But yeah, whatever it's hitting in that flow counts. Okay.
right. Okay, now things are going to get a little contentious.
Oops. Go back. There we go. Code 978. Naming conventions are a gift that you open for yourself.
Now here's the thing, there is no official naming convention for Flow. For example, Mark and I differ on a lot of things.
Exactly. For a variable, when I make a variable, I always start it with VAR. I can type it with one hand, it's very easy.
I prefer VR because you can type it with one hand and it gets rid of things like variable, as object variable, as a collection variable, easier.
Formulas, I just do FRM. It's different, it helps me to remember.
VRF, because if I type VR, I want to see everything that I want to use in my flow.
S object variable, SVAR, I can keep it straight.
VRSO,
For S collections, S call.
closest thing we have, except for I do VRS call.
Yep. And then, anything else, make sure you.
This is why you show up for dry runs. So, the important thing is, though, is be consistent. I don't really care what you call things, but be consistent, not within just the flow, but across the board. If you're building 20 flows, you should be able to take a look at it, see any type of variable or any type of element that you've named, and it should be instantly recognizable because you use that same naming convention throughout every flow in your org. Code 5417. Try new shit.
How do you like my iPhone, Brian?
I so hate you. All right. So
But the point of this is that you should be trying weird and new and different stuff.
but how do we find out about the weird and different stuff?
Maybe your new best friend, release notes.
So the important thing about this is the fact that there's always new things coming out. The Flow team is putting more and more stuff out there. And for us to keep up, you really need to play. You may not have a business case for it, but that's when you say, hey, I'm going to take some personal education time and I'm going to spend an hour testing a new feature that I see in the summer 18 release. Say those local actions we talked about. Because that way, not only do you keep flow-efficient.
Say that 5 times fast.
No. You keep yourself flow-efficient, but you also are able to go, hey, we have this new use case thing to do. Oh, I remember reading about this in the release notes. I can go use those local actions and I'm going to save myself a whole bunch of time.
Code number 24601. Fail to forget, flow formulas are a thing. Thing. I was going for alliteration. Sorry. So, formulas, just like you're making a variable in Flow, you can make a formula as well. It's right there. It's in the same place. And what this is just like a formula field. Nearly all of the exact same functions, there's a guy back there with his jaw dropped. Nearly all the functions that you get in a formula, you can use in a Flow formula as well. So anything you'd be doing for like text transformation, concatenation, using substitute to replace text with other text, adding months to date values, or add -1, so if you want to subtract, doing math, all these different things are all possible. Another thing you can do is actually call the user ID, the running user ID. Now this is important because this is the only place in Flow you can do this without passing it in from the outside. And when you're doing some of these new stuff in Lightning that we showed you earlier today, a lot of those things you cannot pass in additional variables. You can pass in the record it started from, it's that, and that's it. You don't have the ability like we used to be able to do to pass in a variable through the URL. So, by creating a formula, all it contains is the user ID, and that's it. You now have a place where you can get that running user ID, and use that in your Flow, even these other places where you can't otherwise populate it.
Brother Mark, I can't help but notice that you did not follow your naming convention.
We can't all be perfect all the time, Brian.
Okay, so that leaves up this. There's a survey up there if you want to tell me what's streaming, how terrible or funny we were. There's the wonderful survey link to do things. If you want to learn more, there are 2 really great community sites out there on the Trailblazer community. I didn't update that slide to say Trailblazer, did I? Shame on me.
Ooh, that's a bad Brian.
It's fantastic. We also have a couple blogs out there. There's the wizardnews.com, which is my blog.
Self-promotion.
There's Salesforce Yoda's, which is his.
Yeah.
And then our new favorite one is the one on the bottom there with Jennifer Lee, who's putting us to shame in the amount of output.
Shame. All right, so normally we immediately go to Q&A. We're running a little low on time, and we have, Brian, we have something to do.
Yeah, we have giveaways. So, who has questions?
I've got one. Where can we get one of your sweet Flow Addicts t-shirts?
That's a wonderful question. Right there. I wish that was a seamless pen. I'll pay you later. I do have 2 more for people who have good questions, and then if you want, if you go to the wizardnews.com, there is a place where you can buy them, unless you want to hang out and wait till my next giveaway, which I don't know when I'm going to have budget to do so. So next, who's got questions?
This guy had one right here.
Oh, I didn't have a.
Oh.
I just wanted to say, was really fearful of Flow years ago, and then started, checking out your blog and all these other blogs, and we've been really just able to build some incredible flows, and it's made our life a lot easier. I had a lot of questions about some of the new features, but luckily Jen and you guys were able to talk about all these new features, including the count feature.
Flattery, you can see everything, but not quite a t-shirt.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Question back, and then
Can you mentioned there's a debug feature now. Can you use that on flows that already exist?
Yes,
that
you
are
can.
classic?
Yep. It works in, I'm pretty sure it works in Classic.
Yes.
Yeah. So your flow, you open up your flow designer, and if there's one of the buttons up at the top now, it says debug. Like I think it's next to the run button. It's like save as, run. There was a copy and paste buttons, and there's another one that says debug.
And it just emails you kind of right.
No, it actually opens up a runtime that lets you put in variables that you're passing to the flow, and then it actually runs through it, and the same error text, or not necessarily error, but the same like run-through text that you would get in an email shows on the right side while you're actually doing your screen interaction on the left.
So YouTube staff should be a developer and understand that?
No, it's relatively English friendly.
Does anyone actually use the send error capability? I've done what you do and try to build for the challenges, but I've not really come across to me it's easier to build for the scenarios and do the testing. So I'm curious what's the recommendations?
So,
go ahead.
Send error or send email?
Send email, thank you.
Okay. I use send email all the time.
You do?
As long as you can get that email address into it, right? And primarily I do use it for errors. Because I can get different output than I would normally get through the just the normal email that comes through. Plus I can redirect it to whoever I want to receive it, not that default setting.
Fair enough.
Any other questions?
We got 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Yes.
So I'm a very beginner with Flow. I'm not quite a Flow-natic yet, but if I wanted to learn about like what's a variable, what's an S object, what do you recommend resource-wise? Straightforward.
This is like another plan. So if you go to YouTube and type in Wizard Apprentice Kwong, Kwong, I actually have, I think I'm up to 9 videos now that start you from what is a variable all the way up to loops, elements, and updates. And I think I can't remember what the most recent one I just did for a community member. So there's that.
Okay.
Obviously unbiased.
Sorry,
Just go to Wizard Apprentice and then my last name, Kwong, in YouTube, and you'll find my channel. I put a whole bunch of crap on my YouTube. Or you can just go to thewizardnews.com because I put everything out there too. The other one is, I believe it's, I want to say,
Shiv.
Yes.
That's not what it sounded like.
No, I know. He also has a YouTube channel. I just can't remember. Do you remember his site out there?
So just Google maybe like.
Google it.
And
yeah.
Trailhead.
And that,
Trailhead's great
There's
too.
Trailhead.
Okay.
Trailhead got
Thank
some
you.
good stuff. Any other questions?
That deserves a sticker, I think.
Yeah, we've got stickers. One last thing I would like to point out before everybody leaves. If you appreciated what we've done here today, we are not asking you for a cup of coffee. Instead, we would ask that you go to Pep Up Tech and donate to them the amount that you would donate for a cup of coffee.
Yes.
That's how you can show your appreciation to us, by helping them.
Tell them we sent you.
Yeah, well. All right, so we'll be around for a couple minutes. Thank you, everybody. Of course, you can find us at these Twitter addresses. If you ever have any questions, we're happy to help.